Okay, picking up on page 147, I was in the middle of telling you the story of one of my early system design disasters. So they basically said, give us a printout of the data going into the new system. I said, no problem. So I wrote them a little program that just extracted the data prior. It was a batch processing system. And so before being fed into the new system, I just dumped this data. So I went by and said, hey, is everyone happy? And he went, yeah, that's exactly what we needed. Great. And so I came by the next day, and I see a person there with different colored highlighters, and they're looking at a printout, lighting up things. And I said, what are you doing? And I said, oh, well, we need to categorize this by these particular cost elements. I said, oh, well, I could have just sorted that. Oh, you could do that? I went, well, yeah. So, Rev 1, sorted by this cost code. So I went by and I said, okay, is everybody happy? Yeah. You need anything? Nope. Cool, I'm done. So I stopped by a couple more days, and I see him with my printout and the calculator going. I said, what are you doing? I said, well, we need to sum up these numbers in these cost categories. I went, well, why didn't you ask me? I could have the program do that. Oh, we can do that? Well, yeah. So Rev 2. I went in and added a sum at the end of each one of the categories. And the point of this story is I went through several revisions of them, and every single time they were always 100% pleased with the product and could provide me no suggestions whatsoever for any improvements. However, when I looked at it, I could find all sorts of areas of improvement because they could not articulate their requirements. They couldn't do it. They didn't have the right frame of mind. In this particular case, there really wasn't a current system to talk about. So we're talking about, this proposed new system. It's a brand new program. The program only ran for a couple of months to give them the set of, a warm and fuzzy feeling about the new system we were implementing. So it wasn't like a long-term project. But the point of the story is, this was the equivalent of a proposed system that they had no idea. And I would tell them what it is that it could do, and they would go, oh, wow, we had no idea it could do that. Because they don't have the right frame of mind. And I could not, if I had asked them all these questions, what's going on, what's going to happen, they still would not have been able to tell me. I needed some of that JAD kind of a scenario or RAD kind of a scenario where I involved them. And so I quite literally made it a point to stop by after I made a revision. I would stop by a couple of days later and stand over their shoulders and say, show me how you're using this program. And that's how I ended up with my very first example of poor choice of development, because they could not articulate the requirements, and I gave them exactly what they asked for, although that wasn't what they needed. Okay, so this who, what, when, where, and why can help. But again, make sure that you have enough people that can lean forward a little bit in the saddle. Okay, so I'm going to skip over that Zachman framework thing on page 148. That's kind of weird. And let's go directly to doing interviews. So on page 148, they talk about the 7 steps and putting an interview together. Well, the first step on page 149 is determine the people that you want to interview. And this is important for a lot of reasons. First of all, you don't want to be interviewing the wrong people. And secondly, an interview is intrusive. And you do a lot of these, and you're going to get that rolled-eyed look from the managers. It's like, oh, geez, another interview or another questionnaire. They're going to get sick of it after a while. So you got to make these things. You got to interview the right people, and maybe a random sampling of the staff rather than everybody. Okay, so make a list of the people that you're going to interview. That's an excellent choice. Select the right people and ask the right questions. You don't rely on just an organizational chart to go in and say, okay, here's the people I need. You really need more in-depth information about the people you're getting ready to ask for. And you can do group interviews, you can do individual interviews. It kind of just depends. Sometimes there's some synergies involved in a group interview as long as it's not huge. Other times, it's actually better to get information one-on-one because they're more likely to be free to talk about the warts in the new system. Okay, the second step is establishing the objectives. Yeah, you don't just want to have an interview and not know what you're doing. You're gonna, in advance, you want to say, here's the information that I need that the interview is going to solve, basically. So determine the areas that will be discussed and let them know in advance the topics that you're going to be talking about. Because otherwise they're going to say, oh, well, if I knew you were going to talk about that, I would have brought Bob with me, or I would have brought this report with me or something. So tell them what it is you're going to get ready to do. List the facts that you need to gather. Sometimes upper management is the one that's going to provide you the big picture, because you may not be doing an interview with any of the top level management, so you might have to get some of the questions from top level. And then, of course, the users can give you specific details of what it is they do. The step 3 is the actual interview questions. And these are there's 3 different choices that you can have, according to the book, starting on page 149 and beyond. The first one is the open-ended question. This is sort of like if you take one of my tests, this is like one of my essay questions, where I'll ask you a question and you answer with a bunch of words. So it's an open-ended question where you don't really know what you're going to get. You're asking them to describe something or something like that. The closed-ended questions are things like true, false, and fill in the blank, and multiple choice kind of a thing. It's a definitive answer that you're after. Not how long does it take to do step B in this process, and they'll go 10 minutes, and so you write that down. I mean, there's not much else involved. Then the last category is just kind of a range where you're actually trying to get them to do a qualitative kind of things. For example, on a scale of 1 to 10, how important do you think step B is in the process? That kind of a thing. So the 3 steps: open-ended, closed-ended, and a range of response. So interviews that have a mixture of these things do fairly well. And again, don't make these things massively long, because they'll protest. And then, of course, preparing for the interview. It's careful presentation and preparation is going to be essential. Limit the interview to as short as possible. Don't do hour-long interviews unless you absolutely have to. Verify the time and the place. And the book even talks about how, okay, you set up an interview, and maybe it's a whole series of interviews. You're doing one right after the other with a break in between. Follow up with an email saying, okay, just to remind you, you're scheduled for your interview at 3:15 in the conference room. So kind of be nice to them and kind of let them know. Don't necessarily just talk to management saying, okay, management, I need your people here next Tuesday. Ouch. No, you really need to be talking to the people directly, by name. Hopefully like with corporate email, saying, okay, you got tapped to be an interviewee. Okay, and I always like to make sure that you provide them an opportunity to bring things to the table when they show up. So if they have a chart or a form, maybe they've been thinking about this for years, and they're going to bring a whole briefcase full of stuff with them and saying, wow, here's the things that we think need to be done. Super. You never know what you're going to get. Step 5 is actually conducting the interview. So, you basically you plan for the meeting, and, whether it's a one-on-one or together, introduce yourself, just common sense stuff. But there's a little phrase in there on page 151 that I kind of like. It talks about engaged listening. You don't necessarily just kind of sit back and listen. You listen with your entire body. You listen with body language, with tone and inflection, because they're telling you something, and they may be telling you something under duress, so to speak. So pretend like this is Law and Order or whatever your favorite show is on television, where interviewing witnesses and putting people on the stand. It's those kind of questions where you have to pay attention to exactly what they're saying. And the book talks about, taking notes is a good idea, but don't spend all your time taking notes. Maintain that eye contact with the people while you're working with them, and then, of course, take notes afterwards. Which brings us to the next step. Step 6 is the documentation process. So, immediately after the interview, scribble your notes down. That's why you don't do back-to-back interviews. You have a break in between, so you can scribble your notes on what actually was said. And after the interview, it would be kind of cool to send them a little thank you, saying, "Hey, appreciate your input. That was pretty insightful. Can I get back to you on this particular thing that you brought up?" Because again, you're trying to engage them, and the more engaged they are in this process, the better off you're going to be. Okay, so that's the documentation part, and then the last one on page 153 is okay. Now that I've got all this interview, I got to deal with it. So I have to evaluate the data that I collected. I need to find out, did I answer the question that I think I want to answer? So, yeah, you recorded everything, and you tried to remove all sorts of bias involved in this thing. Now, there are some examples there. I'll talk about unsuccessful interviews where, yeah, there's some scenarios where you might go in and, despite your best efforts, these people aren't happy, they don't want this new system, and you're interviewing them, and they're going, yeah, okay, whatever. And they're not interested, and their manager forced them to be there, and it's a total waste of time. That can happen. Okay. Other fact-finding techniques, page 154, they talk about, observation. Now, I've mentioned this to you in that little scenario I just gave you, about I had to stand over the shoulder of the person who was working with the output of this application that I wrote. I had to observe them, because asking them, are you happy with the output? Is there anything you need to make it do to make your life better? Gave me no credible feedback at all. I had no choice but to observe them in order to make the product better. That's just one of those things. So, seeing the system in action gives you all sorts of perspectives on how the thing works and doesn't work. There is a cool thing. They talk about the Hawthorne study. In my previous job, we used to we had craftsmen, and every once in a while we do a productivity improvement kind of a study, and we'd have one of my guys go ride around with a craftsman in a truck when they were doing repairs. And I always found it amusing that, on average, they would do, 5 service orders a day. Unless they had one of my guys riding in the truck, and then they would do, 15, 20 service orders a day while they were being watched. Oh, yeah. So, yeah, the productivity improves an awful lot while you're watching. Anyway, the Hawthorne story was all that about. So, when you're doing observations, try not to be too obstructive. Coming up next is to talk about surveys. I will tell you, there is an art form in putting together a survey. It is incredibly difficult for the average person to just pop in and create a survey and have it done well. In fact, there are people that do surveys for a living in order to remove bias. And you know what I'm talking about. I mean, for example, if you're in the middle of a conversation with me and you get some incredulous tone in your voice, and you say, "You don't throw that away, do you?" They're likely going to say, "No, of course not." Right? Because, you've led them to believe that throwing this thing away was wrong. And so you've injected bias into their answer. And you can do the same kind of thing in a questionnaire by leading them to believe something is, what the answer ought to be. And so what I would suggest is you do like a random sample of an interview, and then find out from that the questions you might want to put on the questionnaire. Because questionnaire could be kind of asynchronous. You can fire it off to email and have people return it back at their leisure, which is pretty doggone cool. Okay, this is coming up on the 15-minute mark, so we'll stop and pick this up again in just a few.